Everyone in the room thought they were watching me lose. That's what their faces said. That mix of pity and relief people wear when they're glad it's happening to someone else. The conference room was full that afternoon. HR, 2 senior managers, my direct supervisor, and 1 person from finance who never spoke unless numbers were involved. A neat stack of papers sat in the middle of the table, perfectly aligned, as if presentation could soften the damage. "This is the best we can do," my supervisor said, sliding the document toward me. "Given the restructuring, you're lucky we're offering anything at all." Lucky. I picked up the papers and read the first page slowly, even though I already knew what it said. Salary reduction. Title adjustment. Expanded responsibilities disguised as cross-functional exposure. It was, without exaggeration, the worst deal of my career. Around me, people shifted in their chairs. No one interrupted. No one defended me. They had already decided how this would end. I had been with the company for years, long enough to remember when it was just a handful of people sharing one printer that jammed every other day. I'd built systems from scratch, trained teams, fixed disasters that never made it into reports because fixing them quietly was my job. Somewhere along the way, competence became expectation, and expectation became entitlement. They believed I would protest. Or negotiate. Or at least hesitate. Instead, I nodded. "I understand," I said calmly. My supervisor blinked. "You do?" "Yes," I replied, flipping to the last page. "Where do I sign?" The finance guy finally looked up, surprised. HR exchanged a quick glance with my manager. There it was, that flicker of satisfaction. The unspoken thought, he knows his place. I signed. Every eye in the room followed my pen as it moved across the paper. No one noticed my expression, because they were too busy feeling validated. This was how they preferred things: quiet compliance, no complications. When I stood up, my supervisor smiled like a man who thought he'd just won something. "Good decision," he said. "This shows maturity." I thanked them, gathered my things, and walked out without another word. What none of them realized, what not a single person in that room bothered to check, was the final page. Buried beneath the salary figures, the new responsibilities, the language carefully crafted to protect the company, was a clause they had copied from an old template without reading it closely. A clause that shifted ownership. A clause that transferred control of a specific process, my process, away from internal operations under very specific conditions. Conditions they had just triggered. I returned to my desk and packed slowly. Colleagues watched from across the office, pretending not to stare. A few sent messages later that evening. "Sorry, man. That was rough." "You okay?" I replied politely. Briefly. No explanations. At home that night, I opened my laptop and logged into a system I had built quietly over the past 2 years. Not on company servers. Not on company time. A system designed to optimize workflows, cut costs, and increase output so efficiently that even small changes had massive ripple effects. I wasn't angry. I wasn't emotional. I was focused. The next morning, I showed up early. Earlier than usual. My supervisor looked surprised to see me. "Everything all right?" he asked, a little too casually. "Perfect," I said. By noon, the first issue appeared. A minor delay. Nothing alarming. Just enough to require attention. By the end of the day, 3 departments were asking questions. By the end of the week, leadership was holding emergency meetings. They couldn't understand why things that had always just worked suddenly didn't. Why reports weren't syncing. Why timelines were slipping by hours, then days. Why costs were creeping upward with no obvious cause. They assumed it was adjustment pains. Growing pains. Anything but the truth. No one thought to ask me. And I didn't offer. Because everyone had watched me accept the worst deal of my career. What they didn't see was what I had just signed away. By Monday morning, the office felt different. Not loud. Not chaotic. Just tense. Like a building that had lost power but was pretending everything was fine. People spoke in lower voices. Screens refreshed more often than usual. A few managers hovered near conference rooms, whispering urgently, glancing at their phones every few minutes. I sat at my desk and worked as if nothing had changed. That was the part that unsettled them the most. Normally, when something broke, I was already halfway to fixing it before anyone asked. This time, I waited. I followed instructions exactly as written. No shortcuts. No silent patches. No behind-the-scenes repairs. By midday, the delay had grown teeth. A process that used to take 30 minutes stretched to 2 hours. Then 3. A client escalation landed in my supervisor's inbox, marked urgent, then remarked critical. He stood up from his chair, paced twice, and finally walked over to my desk. "Hey," he said, forcing a friendly tone. "Quick question." I looked up. "Sure. You're seeing the same delays we are, right?" "I'm following the new workflow," I replied calmly. "Exactly as approved." He nodded slowly, processing that. "Right. Okay. Just keep an eye on it." I watched him walk away, shoulders tight. By Wednesday, leadership was in full reaction mode. Emergency meetings stacked on calendars. Emails flew back and forth, heavy with phrases like temporary disruption and unexpected complexity. Consultants were mentioned. Budgets were quietly revised. Someone finally asked the question that should have been asked first. Does anyone know how this system actually works? The room went quiet. My name was mentioned, tentatively, like a rumor. He used to handle most of it, someone said. But he signed the new agreement. That agreement. HR pulled it up. Scrolled through it carefully for the first time. Legal joined the call. Silence stretched as they reached the final pages. The clause. The one no one had read closely enough. The language was dry, almost boring. But the meaning was devastating. The moment they reclassified my role and responsibilities, ownership and control of that specific process shifted. Not away from me to someone else. Away from the company entirely. A consultant finally said what everyone was thinking. "So you're saying, you don't own the mechanism that made this work?" No one answered. They called me into a meeting that afternoon. Not confrontational. Not aggressive. Polite. Careful. Like people approaching something they were afraid might bite. "We just want to understand," my supervisor said, hands folded tightly on the table. "Is there anything you can do to help stabilize things?" I met his eyes. "Under the new agreement, my scope is very limited." He swallowed. "But you know how to fix it." "Yes," I said. "I do." "Then why aren't you?" "Because you didn't ask when it mattered." "I didn't say that." "I didn't need to." "I'm doing exactly what the contract requires," I replied. Nothing more. Nothing less. The meeting ended without resolution. That night, I received an email marked confidential. Then another. Then a call I didn't answer. They were scrambling. By the end of the second week, the damage was visible. Missed deadlines turned into lost confidence. Lost confidence turned into lost accounts. Investors started asking why forecasts no longer matched reality. Externally, they blamed market conditions. Internally, they blamed each other. Someone suggested reversing the deal. Another suggested offering incentives. A third suggested quietly bringing me back into decision-making without changing anything on paper. They were all too late. I had already accepted an offer elsewhere. A company that had studied my work carefully before approaching me. They didn't ask if I was cheap. They asked if I was available. When I told my supervisor I'd be leaving at the end of the notice period, he looked genuinely shocked. You're really going? He asked. Yes. After everything we've invested in you? I thought of the salary cut. The silent room. The pens watching my signature. You invested in what I produced, I said calmly. Not in me. He didn't argue. The day I cleared my desk, people avoided eye contact again. Not out of relief this time, but discomfort. They could feel it now, the weight of a decision that had already cost them more than they expected. As I walked out, my phone buzzed. A message from the head of legal. We need to talk about the clause. I smiled, slipped the phone back into my pocket, and stepped into the elevator. They were finally reading what I had signed. And they still didn't understand what was coming next. They reached out 3 days after I left. Not casually. Not politely. Urgently. The email came from legal, marked confidential immediate attention. It was carefully worded, the way messages are when panic is trying to sound professional. They wanted to clarify intent, discuss interpretation, avoid unnecessary disruption. I read it once. Then again. Then I closed my laptop and went for a walk. By the time I returned, my phone was full of missed calls. My former supervisor. Someone from HR. A number I recognized as an executive assistant. The same people who had watched me sign away my value without blinking were suddenly very interested in my understanding of the document. I didn't call back. Instead, I forwarded the email to my lawyer. 2 hours later, the response went out. Short. Direct. Calm. The clause was valid. The transfer was legal. The conditions had been met. There was nothing to clarify. That was when everything unraveled. Inside the company, the situation escalated quickly. What had started as delays became failures. Processes that relied on my system began collapsing under pressure. Costs spiked. Delivery timelines slipped beyond recovery. Clients who had tolerated small issues lost patience. Leadership called emergency sessions almost daily. I heard later that someone finally said it out loud in one of those meetings. We built the company on something we don't own anymore. That sentence changed the tone of the room. They tried to replicate the system. They couldn't. They tried to outsource it. Consultants charged millions and delivered fragments. They tried to pressure me quietly through intermediaries. Nothing worked. Investors noticed next. Quarterly numbers missed targets for the first time in years. Analysts began asking uncomfortable questions on earnings calls. The stock dipped. Not dramatically at first, but enough to make people nervous. That's when the board stepped in. An internal review was launched. Not about the system, but about how the company had allowed such a dependency to exist without safeguards. Emails were pulled. Decisions were traced. Names appeared again and again. The same names. The director who had approved the salary cut was the first to go. Officially, it was called a mutual separation. Unofficially, everyone knew why. He had signed off on a deal he didn't understand and dismissed someone he couldn't replace. My former supervisor lasted a little longer. He tried to defend himself, claimed he was following instructions, blamed restructuring pressures. It didn't matter. He was removed from his role quietly and reassigned to something meaningless until he eventually resigned. The company issued a press release weeks later, announcing a strategic shift and a renewed focus on innovation. The market wasn't convinced. Meanwhile, my life moved in the opposite direction. At my new company, things were different from the start. They didn't test my loyalty with pressure. They didn't confuse control with leadership. They asked questions. They listened to answers. They gave me room to build. Within months, the same framework, adapted, refined, properly supported, was live again. This time, with my name on it. Not as a credit line buried in documentation, but as ownership. The results were immediate. Efficiency improved. Costs dropped. Output stabilized. Clients noticed. Word spread. I was invited to meetings I never would have been allowed into before. Not because I demanded it, but because my presence made things work better. One evening, months later, I received a message from an unfamiliar address. It was from someone on the old board. Just one line. "You were right. We should have seen it sooner." I didn't reply. Not because I was angry. Because I didn't need the validation anymore. The final moment came quietly. A former colleague sent me a news article. The headline was neutral, almost boring. A brief mention of declining performance. A note about leadership changes. A sentence about selling off a division. The very one my system had once held together. I closed the article and sat back. There was no rush of triumph. No sense of revenge fulfilled. Just a steady understanding. They hadn't lost because I planned their downfall. They lost because they mistook silence for weakness, compliance for consent, and loyalty for obligation. I had accepted the worst deal of my career in front of everyone. And they thought that was the end of it. What they never saw was the clause I signed. Not because it was hidden. But because they never bothered to look.